Well, it's Groundhog Day. Again. And that must mean that I am Professor Robert E. G. Black. And this is the Groundhog Day Project.
It's like we're stuck. You know, like a needle on a scratch record.
It's one of those infinite time loop situations you might have heard about.
It's a thing where the same day keeps happening?
I wake up every day right here, right in Punxsutawney, and it's always February 2nd.
Time.
I promise to explain everything later, but I need you to trust me.
Slow down! What are you, in a damn time loop or something?
We've reached minute 10 of Groundhog Day in our minute-by-minute coverage, but also this episode releases just 2 days before this year's Groundhog Day, so I'm expecting some new audience members jumping in, so I should probably welcome them first. The Groundhog Day project began as a daily blog in 2013. I watched the film Groundhog Day every day for a year and blogged about it, about related tangents, about other time loop films or TV episodes or series, or books. And after that first year, I watched other movies every day, often grouping them so that, for example, I had a month of slasher films, a month of romantic comedies, a month of westerns, etc. And once a month, I would return to Groundhog Day and link it back to whatever was going on in the blog that month. Additionally, I completed my master's in communication studies with a thesis about blogging and the creation of self on the internet, using my own blog along with two others as comparative through lines. The blog paused a couple times, but returned to complete eventually a total of 1,461 entries. The final year's worth of entries was me specifically exploring movies that were fixtures of my childhood, to imagine what they taught me about the world, and helped form my worldview, and my view of movies. In 2018, before the final entries of that blog, mind you, I began podcasting in the Movies by Minutes format with Michael Myers Minute, covering 1978's Halloween, 1 minute at a time. Occasionally with fellow Movies by Minutes podcasters as guests. More such podcasts followed: Dave Made a Minute, The Room Minute, Annihilation Minute, Mandy Sucks Minute, Cock and Bull Movie Talk, 2 Minutes About Time, Pump Up the Minute, 5 Minute Arrival, and I had lengthy guest hosting spots on Hitchcock Minute covering North by Northwest, Into the Night Minute, Best Minutes Podcast covering the best years of our lives, Silverado Minute, and the Bowfinger Minute podcast, and many one-off guest spots on a bunch of other shows. The Groundhog Day Project podcast you're listening to right now began life as Groundhog Day Minute by Minute, which was both a continuation of my blog in spirit more than in form, and as part of a trilogy of linked podcasts, along with Minutia Ex Machina and Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Minute. There were guests. Scheduling recording sessions and editing all of the episodes myself got a little taxing, and, well, after a hiatus, the other two shows got put on hold, and I brought back this show in its current form, which is closer in form to the blog than the Movies by Minutes format, often using entries of the blog as the script for episodes. While there are episodes devoted to specific minutes of the film, there are many other things going on as well. For example, Season 2, Episode 42, focused on Minute 8 of the film. But before I got to Minute 9, there were episodes devoted to blog entries, Day 234, 242, 246, 247, 1037, and 173, as well as a critique of a reporter's piece about watching the movie every day. Minute 9 was not the focus until Episode 50, 8 episodes after Minute 8. Since covering Minute 9, there's been an episode devoted to the DJ banter from the film and the stage musical, a reading of the blog entry for Day 33, and a guide to character names. Footnote to last week's episode about names: at some point I was able to read the ER nurse's name tag. It says A. Broadbent RN. The episode you're listening to now is Season 2, Episode 54. Prior to even opening the video file for the minute to be covered, the script was already 2,975 words. This is Minute 10 of Groundhog Day. At the end of Minute 9, Phil entered the breakfast room at the Cherry Street Inn. We got a quick look at everyone else in the room. At the front end of the room, we've got 3 tables, an old couple, a young couple with an older woman, a family of 4. Moving among them is an uncredited waitress. At the back end of the room, an old couple sits at a table in the corner, and an old man stands nearby. Note, the younger couple with the old woman at the front end, and all three of the extras at the back end table will be seen later as well in the Jeopardy scene. In Rubin's original, the breakfast room was described as an old library with a buffet set up for coffee and rolls. A handful of guests are milling about, eating. One wall is lined with bookcases filled with books. In the second revision and after, it's barely changed. Phil enters the old library of the house, now set up with a breakfast buffet. An old spinet piano stands in the corner. One wall is lined with bookcases filled with books. In the film, there are very few books in this room. Just a handful of shelves we can see on either side of the buffet, and one full bookcase. But in Rubin's original, Phil uses the books in the Cherry Street Library to track how long time has been looping. He reads a single page of a book each day, running from top left to bottom right on the shelves. Then when he reaches the end, he adds up the page totals. When he throws himself a birthday party near the end of Rubin's original, he claims to be 263 years old. Rubin's Phil is around 28 when he enters the loop, meaning he has been looping for 235 years. That is 85,775 iterations of February 2nd. Note, of course, Bill Murray was 41 during production, as the age ranges for Phil and Rita had been switched in the script revisions. And the film offers us no such specification as to how long the looping has been going on. And I actively reject anyone's claims as to the length. For example, YouTube comments on deleted scenes posted just in the last couple weeks include, "This adds another few months to the 10 to 20 years he was trapped for. Poor Phil, trapped for 34 years in Groundhog Day. He spent 86 years, 4 months, 13 days in the time loop, just saying. He was living the time loop for 36,000 years, that's what I like to think anyway, or maybe 99,000, or maybe 10 million, or maybe just a year." Helpful. Me, I prefer not to calculate, though I have done so in the blog, because it misses the point of the film. It's not about quantity, it's about quality, and you're not going to get a prescription for yourself. At that birthday party in Rubin's original, Florence Lancaster gives Phil one of the books from the library because, as she puts it, "You seem very interested in my books." Mrs. Lancaster is, of course, played by Angela Patton in the film. From her IMDb bio. Born 11th January 1930 in Brooklyn, New York, Angela Patton was described as a natural comic and one of the legends of the stage of San Francisco. She is a veteran of the American Conservatory Theater and also one of ACT's leading actresses in its first few seasons. After leaving ACT in the early 1970s, Patton and her husband founded and ran the Berkeley Stage Company for a number of years. Since then, she and her husband, theater director Robert Goldsby, moved to Malibu, California, where they lived until 2015. Patton appeared in 38 films and over 50 TV series. She also continued her decades-long run of regional theater work across the country, including her 2014 role in the Broadway play Harvey. She died 26th May 2016 of a heart attack. In the film, Mrs. Lancaster approaches the buffet on the west wall as minute 10 begins. Phil has just entered at the southeast corner of the room, also heading for that buffet. Ryan Gilbey, in his 2004 BFI breakdown of the film, points out the mirror on the buffet. He says, "A mirror is mounted behind the bureau, framing Phil's reflection, trapping him. The wallpaper has pink stripes, candy-colored prison bars." The wallpaper in the breakfast room is striped, white, light blue, and dark blue. The light blue stripes are faded, but they are not pink. The wall does have pink wainscoting below the wallpaper, but since we barely get a good look at any of the wall anyway, as Phil is either in motion in this scene, the camera following him, or framed in front of the buffet, I don't think we can read into it. Otherwise, we might have to read into the flowered wallpaper in the hall, or the different flowered paper in Phil's room upstairs. The wallpaper in Anderson's, the candy and ice cream shop seen in minute 49, is also striped. While the framing with the mirror, if you think it's there, might be a deliberate choice by director Harold Ramis or cinematographer John Bailey, or both, we cannot treat one wallpaper as meaningful if we cannot similarly treat the others as such. By the way, it's the wallpaper in the TV room, where they watch Jeopardy, that has pronounced pink stripes. The buffet setup. Within an arched alcove on the western wall of the room is a large piece of furniture. There are bookshelves at either end with glass doors. There are drawers and cabinets in the lower half of center, and organized on the top of the whole cabinet are some books and some decorative glassware. But what I want to hone in on here is the buffet itself, framed between two decorative pillars at the center of the whole cabinet. It contains, mostly left to right, a plant, a lamp, several plates of various pastries, a large glass punch bowl with ladle of either fruit punch with fruit chunks inside or possibly sangria, a pitcher of orange juice, a basket of various breads, several fruit-shaped containers. One definitely resembles a pumpkin. One looks like it might be an apple. These containers, I'm guessing, contain jams and jellies. Some red roses in a glass vase, a double tray of tiny cereal boxes, and a toaster with 4 slices of bread ready to be toasted. Somewhere in the middle of the room, we never get a sequence in this room that isn't shot from around the center, so we never really see the setup in the middle of the room, is a table, maybe a movable cart, with a coffee maker and another vase of flowers on it. On the wall opposite the buffet, there is a fireplace that we never get a clear view of. On its mantel is a plant, 2 glass containers of an amber-colored liquid, and a set of about 12 matching books in 2 groups on either end of the mantel. Looking north just a few seconds ago, in minute 9, we would have seen the waitress, dressed in blue slacks, pink blouse, and graying apron, was interacting with the tables by the windows at the front end of the room. As minute 10 begins, somehow she has teleported. As Phil moves right across the back end of the room, she passes him going left. Phil passes the piano, and don't worry if you never noticed that it's there. It is in the southwest corner of the room, about to be framed behind Phil's weatherman shtick, but it is covered in cloth, has a plant sitting on top of it that blends into a plant in the foreground in the middle of the room, and it is never the focus of the shot. Camera moves right with Phil, and stops moving as Phil turns toward the coffee maker, out of frame, and Mrs. Lancaster is visible out of focus behind him, standing at the buffet. The camera has stopped moving by second 4. Phil has not yet been framed by the mirror, per Gilby. Phil sets his coat down, out of frame, near the coffee maker. Florence, dressed in a blue dress and flowered white apron, clears her throat as Phil and camera bring her into frame. She speaks. Mrs. Lancaster. Did you sleep well, Mr. Connors? Did you sleep well? Was the title for the Groundhog Day Project blog, day 162, dated 10th January 2014. Even before she is in focus here, we can see the giant grin on Florence's face. She seems to genuinely enjoy interacting with her guests. Phil turns to face her, and it's an amusingly energetic move, like he's practiced this. No matter how much he dreads having to face the proprietor of this small-town bed and breakfast, he switches into amiable mode. He can do this. Focus pull so that Florence is clear. Phil, his back to us, steps toward the buffet, eyeing the spread there. In the second and third revision, Phil answers, with mock civility, like a Romanian orphan, Mrs. Lancaster. In the film, I Slept Alone, Mrs. Lancaster. I Slept Alone, Mrs. Lancaster was the title for the Groundhog Day Project blog, day 11/28, dated 2nd September 2017. She laughs like she is genuinely amused by his innuendo. She puts a hand out toward him, a natural connection with a stranger that, well, I'm guessing Phil did not process his own check-in yesterday. He probably made Rita do that part, so Florence has probably not even met this man yet, though she definitely knows who he is. But who he is doesn't matter, because what he is one of her guests. Phil puts his hands onto the buffet counter and looks over at Florence. Were she a couple decades younger, he might shift even more into flirting mode, but she's not, and he really wants to get going. He looks around the buffet, but maybe it's just him playing at interest more than he's actually deciding if any of this looks good. Florence gestures with a hand toward the coffee maker, still out of frame. Mrs. Lancaster, would you like some coffee? Turning slightly toward Florence again, but not toward the coffee just yet, Phil responds. I don't suppose there's any possibility of getting... Now he turns to look back toward the coffee. But not for long. By the time he gets to cappuccino, he's looking at Florence again. An espresso or cappuccino this morning, is there? Patton plays this next line not entirely like she doesn't know what these drinks are, but she definitely knows that Cherry Street offers neither. and you know she hates to disappoint a guest. Mrs. Lancaster. Oh. Phil looks away from Florence, past camera. It feels like an improv move, looking to the audience like, can you believe this gal? Florence looks to the right, away from Phil. Is she lost at the mention of drinks she does not know? Embarrassed by the mention of drinks she knows but does not have? Or is she looking for that waitress because she knows there's that place in town that does have espresso and cappuccino, and if Phil is willing to wait, she will send the waitress to get some and bring it back. But also, it's well after 6, and she knows Phil is there for the festivities and probably doesn't have the time to wait. I really don't know, She puts a hand to her temple. Whatever the nature of her struggle, Phil of course assumes ignorance. He moves toward the coffee maker that has still not been in frame. Camera moves again with Phil, pulling away from the buffet. In the second revision, Phil answers, forget it, this'll be fine. In the third, we're getting into the stage whisper snark. How to spell it. Forget it, this'll be fine. In the final, how to spell espresso or cappuccino. Forget it, this'll be fine. In the film, how to spell espresso or cappuccino. Stage whisper on that first part, but Florence is flustered enough already that the specifics here don't much matter. Finally, the coffee maker comes into view at bottom of frame. Phil grabs a cup lower still out of frame and adds, in a more friendly tone, this looks fine. The camera stops moving again, second 25. Florence is able to recover. Hands together, a smile on her face. She takes a few steps toward Phil as he gets some coffee. Mrs. Lancaster. I hope you enjoy the festivities. I hope you enjoy the festivities was the title for the Groundhog Day Project blog, day 90, dated 30th October 2013. Phil. Oh yeah, I'm sure I'm going to. He rolls his eyes, tongue out, but then turns around to face her. He has a way of being a dick mostly without it being obvious to the person. Essentially, he's playing to camera. Not that that makes Phil any less of an ass. Florence makes another play at conversation. Mrs. Lancaster. There's a talk of a blizzard. This is better conversation prompting on Mrs. Lancaster's part than in, say, the second revision, where she effectively asks Phil for a response rather than this, well, chit-chat. In the second and third revision, she says, as she pours, I wonder what the weather's going to be like for all the festivities. Phil responds, my guess is it'll be cold and overcast. High today in the low 30s, dropping to the low 20s tonight, but I'm predicting that all that moisture coming up from the Gulf is going to miss us and dump some locally heavy snow. Possibly blizzard conditions with travel advisories in the Harrisburg area, and maybe as far east as Philadelphia. Off her surprised look. You want to talk weather? You asked the right guy. In the final revision, Mrs. Lancaster has her line, there's talk of a blizzard. Phil's response is close to the film version. No, the blizzard's landing due east of here, missing us completely. Gesturing, as if on TV. This low-pressure system is coming down from the north, sucking all this moisture up from the Gulf, freezing it, pushing the disturbance easterly, and paralyzing Altoona. That leaves Punxsutawney cold and overcast, high today in the low 30s, dropping to the low 20s tonight. Chance of precipitation, 20%. Off her surprised look. Did you want to talk weather, or did you just want to chit-chat? Mrs. Lancaster, at a loss. Well, The film version. New camera angle, close to Florence. She is framed shoulders to top of head at the right side of frame. Blurry in the background, the piano and a painting on wood-paneled section of wall. Phil, taking up most of the left half of frame, turns toward Florence. As he gets going, the waitress returns, crossing in the background from left to right. Phil. Well, we may catch a break and that blizzard's going to blow right by us. He has taken a step away from Florence and turns sideways. Full weatherman mode, with hand gestures and everything. I imagine he does this sort of thing at bars or parties back in Pittsburgh, and spends the night with whichever woman is amused by his shtick. All of this moisture coming up out of the south by midday is probably going to push on to the east of us, and at high altitudes it's going to crystallize and give us what we call snow. Probably be some accumulation. He steps away from the imaginary weather map and takes a step toward Florence. But here in Punxsutawney, our high will be about 30 today, teens tonight. Catch a Break was the title for Groundhog Day Project blog day 255, dated 13th April 2014. Probably Be Some Accumulation was the title for day 58, dated 28 September 2013. And Teens Tonight was the title for day 608, dated 1st April 2015. New camera angle, second 44, a reverse almost. Phil is large on left side of frame now, and Florence has most of the right side of frame, but she looms smaller here than he did in the previous shot. She is overwhelmed by all of this, but she is definitely listening closely. Phil continues. Chance of precipitation about 20% today, 20% tomorrow. Phil is not being nice, but he's so polished here that Mrs. Lancaster seems to enjoy the performance, or is just as good at humoring her guests as Phil is at this bullshit charm. She smiles and says, "Oh." Before Phil switches back to asshole mode, it's worth noting that this weather shtick comes in the film as a specific echo of lines he has already said on the air yesterday, back in minute 2. But in production, that whole sequence was added after all the Punxsutawney stuff was complete, replacing a longer station sequence that had been in a few revisions of the script. Danny Rubin's original screenplay, of course, began in media res, with Phil already deep into the loop. In Rubin's original, we get this exchange between Phil and Mrs. Lancaster on page 4. The old matron of the house, Mrs. Lancaster, spots Phil as she comes out of the kitchen. Phil, no thank you. Mrs. Lancaster, could I get you some coffee? Phil, cold and overcast. Mrs. Lancaster, I wonder what the weather... Phil, stay an extra day. Mrs. Lancaster, will you be checking out? Phil, thank you. Phil continues to the front door. Mrs. Lancaster, enjoy the groundhog. Because of the structural changes, in the second revision we are on page 13, third revision page 14, final revision page 9, when Phil enters the breakfast room. And then the addition of the studio sequence after primary production, Phil's spiel here in the film is not really the echo. This one happened first. I explain this distinction because I think it's funnier that Phil, in the experience of the film, is here echoing mindlessly a version of something he's already said and we've already heard. In order to come across as charming here, he has shifted into weatherman mode, which would be cute if he didn't undercut it by shifting immediately into condescending asshole mode. Back to the previous angle, Phil taking up left half of frame, Florence diminished at the right edge of frame. Phil continued, did you want to talk about the weather, or were you just making chit-chat? I'm being too friendly. The friendliness is all but gone from his voice. Did you want to talk about the weather, or were you just making chit-chat? Did you want to talk about the weather was the title for the Groundhog Day Project blog, day 85, dated 25th October 2013, or were you just making chit-chat was the title for day 86, dated 26th October 2013. Back to the two-shot from over by the coffee, the camera that's been following Phil's progress through this space. Florence's hands come apart and then go back together. She smiles. Mrs. Lancaster. Chit-chat. Phil nods, smiles, says, okay. Then he returns to the coffee, his back to Florence again. He grabs his coffee with his right hand. He leans past the coffee maker to retrieve his coat and scarf with his left hand. He says, see you later. And you can see the change on Florence's face. If this were a battle, she just realized that she lost. He is making a beeline for the exit, crossing left to right across frame between us and Florence by the time he says, bye. He's almost out of frame when Florence remembers that she has a question. She moves toward camera, owning the frame that Phil has now exited. She is no longer frustrated with this conversation. Mrs. Lancaster, will you be checking out today, Mr. Connors? By the time that line is ended, second 59, we are on the reverse. A little bit of the wall of the breakfast room taking most of the left half of frame, the open doorway into the entry hall taking up the right. We can see the doorway opposite and the TV room beyond at right edge of frame. Phil is framed just right of center, stopped to put on his coat. Will you be checking out today, Mr. Connors, was the title for the Groundhog Day Project blog, day 550, dated 2nd February 2015. And that question will remain unanswered as minute 10 ends. Also, there will not be a time loop of the week this week, because this episode was going long already in the script. I should explain. I try every episode, but I don't always remember, to have a time loop of the week where basically I give a brief review of some other time loop movie or TV episode, video game, or what have you, and tell you how it relates, type of loop it is. Whether it's science fiction and they have to solve the loop, or whether it's more experiential looping like Phil Connors, a Connors loop. Or both, like in Happy Death Day. Well, I guess she's not really solving the loop in Happy Death Day. She solves it in Happy Death Day 2. It's not my time loop of the week, I'm not going to get into it. In addition to the information in the pre-recorded outro that follows, I would invite you to follow me on any social media at Robert E.G. Black, including Blue Sky, where I sometimes post random thoughts about movies I'm watching, often out of context, making them very strange and random bon mots. Poetry, if you will. Like this recent example. Jester is a drama queen. Spins his face around and around just to land on a look that he's barely concerned. And Letterboxd, where I have taken to reviewing every movie I watch, 558 in 2024, and am currently making an effort to insert every entry from my Groundhog Day Project blog as a review of Groundhog Day. For those of you whose first episode this is, welcome. Thanks for sticking through it. It's not always as long or dense as this episode, but I wanted something that was both special and very much me. Anyway, I have not decided as I finished writing the script for this episode whether I will read a blog entry about Mrs Lancaster next week or move on to minute 11. But in the end, this script was 4,266 words.
Knew you were gonna say that.
This has been a production of Lemming Drops Studio. You can find links to more at lemmingdrops.com or join the Facebook group Lemming Drops Studio Tour. Also, you can support all my shows at patreon.com/lemmingdrops.
What is wrong in the end which never comes? Or which comes again and again, lapping, like waves.
Since the Big Bang set everything in motion, everything that happens in this universe has to be the way it is. Particles unfolding the way they're destined to.
How do you sleep at night? You've never seen Groundhog Day?
Yeah, you know Groundhog Day is not a documentary.
Remember when Groundhog Day was just a movie?